There is a moment in every fight where the question is, do we give up or keep pushing in this negotiation? And we've just seen Democrats truly, make that choice. And that is a result of, right, the pressure building and someone saying, let's just be reasonable. And the problem is that reason sometimes is just exhaustion wearing a tie, right? And surrendering is, in many cases, in a business negotiation or in a political moment, forgetting your own worth. This is truly what it is. So I have a couple of different examples of this that I've been sort of diving into. I've sort of been looking into negotiations and the history of negotiations, and I'm always very interested in the ways in which you can sort of formalize them and describe them in sort of formal, sort of tactical and strategic terms. And so in 2008, there was an enormous financial crisis, you'll recall, and two very small nations were swallowed up by that storm. They both went bankrupt, and they were both, blamed very deeply by central banks. So the two I'm thinking of are Greece and Iceland. Greece capitulated to the European Central Bank. They gave up. They folded first. And they promised austerity. They begged for forgiveness. And the logic sort of was here, let's be reasonable. Let's stay in the club. Let's not get into trouble. Iceland, meanwhile, much smaller country. It's a little bit of apples and oranges here, and full of natural resources beyond tourism, said no. They said to the central bank, let the banks fail. Let the currency collapse. We are going to own this because we would rather not be tied to debt. 10 years later, Greece was still chained to its debt, right? And Iceland was back to growth. This isn't a question, I think, of one being vastly smarter than the other. It's the confidence that each had and the ability of a group of lawmakers to hang together. One nation, in the midst of all of that, and this is Greece, I would say, forgot how valuable it was. And the other one held out long enough to remember what it was worth, and through short-term suffering, got something very big. Here's another example. In 1940, France collapses under the Nazi invasion, right? And there's two generals involved in that. One is Marshal Pétain, who is in France, and then there's Charles de Gaulle, who is in exile. So Pétain basically said, we have to be realistic, right? He signed this armistice. He installed a puppet government in Vichy, right? De Gaulle, meanwhile, flees to London and gets behind a radio and just declares France has lost a battle but not the war, and it doesn't give up. I mean, France going into World War II had one of the largest land armies in the world, and yet it capitulated in about 6 weeks. So, it could have stood its ground. It would have been horrific, of course, but it could have split the Nazi forces in a really powerful way. And then you have these two generals with these very, very different things, right? And Pétain got peace, but he created a collaborationist government, right, that was an absolute stain on the history of France. De Gaulle got exile and later was put in charge of the nation, right? He really held out. One surrendered for comfort, and the other one really held out for long-term meaning and got what he wanted. The strategic power of holding out really only works when you control a scarce asset, right? Oil routes or patents or public legitimacy, or in the case of Democrats, the power to reopen the government. Two is you got to be able to survive isolation, right? Iceland could, Greece could not. And you have to be able to read time correctly. You got to know that the future will reward your patience, your patience, because otherwise this is just sort of dead-ended brinksmanship. It's not real strategy. And, the art of holding out well has time and again been a question of having the leverage, having the time, but then, also believing in your worth. When people cease to believe in their worth, capitulating too early, it doesn't just lose the battle, it erases the value of having held out at all. That is the tragedy of early capitulation. And I guess my question for you is, have we just seen, in the case of Democrats, fail to do what I would argue is one of the hardest things in the world, to know their own worth long enough to make everyone else believe it too?